Hey everybody, welcome to another I Comply webinar in our summer series. Today we're going to be talking about Schedule 3. There's a lot of buzz out there in terms of what it could mean for the industry, in terms of banking, financing, different tax breaks that are long overdue for normal businesses. But today I wanted to delve a lot deeper into what the compliance standards are around Schedule 3 and what it means to update your business in order to comply with Schedule 3. Initially, there's a lot of anticipation that the clinical data we've been researching with 300 plus clinical trials in the US alone are going to be really paramount to determining the efficacy of these products and really being able to roll out marijuana medicines that can be prescribed by a physician and otherwise imported or exported around the world where other countries are already legalizing and where people are giving out medical marijuana that is largely imported or exported. So it's a brand new opportunity, I think, for a lot of US businesses to engage in the international marketplace for the first time. And the FDA already has a long-standing history of what the rules and regulations look like for Schedule 3 substances. So marijuana is not the only one. There's plenty of other Schedule 3 substances out there, including opiates and other medicinal products, a lot of times derived from botanical medicines. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And there's really primarily two documents I want to focus on today and sets of rules. One is the Code of Federal Regulations, specifically under Title 21, and all the FDA's guidance for botanical medicine cultivation, what it means to bring your grows into compliance to be able to produce cannabis that can then be manufactured into a pharmaceutical drug, which then can be marketed, advertised, imported, exported, and otherwise distributed. I think one of the biggest challenges that people don't realize is, and this was maybe something you did realize if you were able to look at the DEA rescheduling comments that came out, but the FDA has never actually approved a botanical medicine for use or prescription. So a lot of the thinking that we're going to be having marijuana flower floating around the US and in between state borders and doing interstate commerce, I think is really a false nomer about rescheduling this to Schedule 3. So keep in mind that there may be shipments of cannabis in between states, but it's going to have to come under this highly regulated regime. So first thing I'll share with you is an important resource, which is really just the Code of Federal Regulations. And I'll go ahead and share my screen here. So you get an idea of kind of what I'm looking at here as well. And I'll post it also in the chat for your ability to follow along. But this is the Code of Federal Regulations and specifically Title 21, which really governs the manufacturing, distribution of botanical, I should say, of pharmaceutical products. So you can come to this Code of Regulations. You can search here in the parts and the different sections of what we're looking at. So the first part I kind of want to note is CFR Part 1300, which deals with the rescheduling of controlled substances and the overall scheduling of controlled substances. So in there, you'll see the reclassification category to Schedule 3, which would involve a lot of updates to the schedules in this part, reflecting, of course, cannabis in there. In 13-01, there's the defined controlled chemicals and a list of those. And you'll notice cocaine is in there, opium is in there, cannabis is not included. So the first thing that's going to happen, ideally, is that you start to see THC and other cannabinoids that are derived from cannabis under Schedule 3 start to be included in this list of controlled chemicals. Further on in 1300-02, you've got definitions relating to those listed chemicals, and a lot of the import and export regulations and laws are contained herein. What it means to have foreign research that could be potentially used for buying substances we produce out of the US and being able to export those, assuming we're meeting all of these other regulatory standards. There's also some information about the disposal of controlled substances. We're not looking at maybe the same waste disposal procedures we're used to with state regulations. Moving on from there, there's CFR Parts 2010 and also 211. And these parts really govern good manufacturing practices. You've probably heard GMP used as a buzzword, especially when it relates to international commerce. Canada is all about it. Europe is all about it. You may have heard EU GMP. But these are a set of governing standards that cannabis medicines will need to comply with to produce them under GMP environments. So a lot of the information in these sections, 2010-03, defines those GMP terms and the applications for GMP when it comes to drug manufacturing. So we're looking at subparts A through K on 211, which really define the quality control units you need to establish in your facility. That's a team of people that oversees quality assurance and quality control. The building design components that are going to be necessary. Many people are going to have to update their cultivation facilities, their manufacturing facilities to comply with GMP. The equipment design standards, control of the components that go into these medicines, containers, as well as other uh, other closures, and also testing protocols. In drug manufacturing, a lot of pharmaceutical companies do their own testing internally. That's something we haven't seen in the cannabis industry, and may or may not be allowed with regard to the states and the federal government's code set of laws also matching up. So currently, we're a patchwork of different laws between the states, and there is no federal standard for testing marijuana. That's something that we don't even have really in hemp. And the FDA looked at even trying to define CBD and hemp standards under the Farm Bill, and they failed to do so after 4 years, kicking it back to Congress for additional legislation to be passed in order to have the guidance that they needed to be able to regulate something that isn't psychoactive, such as CBD. Is it a nutraceutical? Is it an over-the-counter product? Is it something that should be on a controlled substances list? So really looking at these GMP standards is important in getting a better understanding of what a quality management system is. How do you implement that? What do your SOPs and process controls need to look like under GMP? And the packaging and labeling that's pretty standard for all medicines in the US is all contained under this 211 and its subparts, including holding distribution, laboratory controls, records and reports, as well as drug salvaging or reprocessing and returns of drugs in the marketplace. So these two sections are really important when it comes to GMP and something to certainly be aware of. Before we can even get into manufacturing cannabis the right way or cultivating it the right way, we need to talk about how that medicine is going to be used. And of course, anything on a schedule in the US has to have clinical data to back up the actual IND, or the Investigational New Drug Program process. So you're going to have clinical data and clinical trials that show that there's safety and efficacy in using a therapeutic product and developing new treatments. And CFR 21 section 312 actually goes over the IND, or the Investigational New Drug Program, which oversees cannabis medicines likely, and which will be backed by clinical trial for data regarding production, labeling, promotion, and sales. You're going to have investigational phases in the IND. There's different phases of different clinical trials that have to be set: preclinical, phase 1, phase 2, and usually through phase 3. And there's also a great document I'll share here in just a minute with regard to the FDA's guidance on botanical medicines, written in 2004. So long before there was a cannabis industry, there's sort of a pathway and what it takes to get that data, and the clinical data especially, into these applications for IND, what those investigational phases look like during the IND process, any administrative actions that may come as a result of the FDA's review, responsibilities for sponsors and investigators in that process, and investigational use on even things like research animals or in vitro. So all of that is sort of considered under this subpart, and may be part of what it takes to get cannabis medicines to the forefront for doctors to prescribe nationwide. It also includes a lot of information in this Part 312 about the import and export requirements and the foreign clinical studies that may not be being conducted under US IND. So a lot of other countries, Israel's been studying cannabis, for example, since the 1950s, may have a lot more information on the clinical efficacy and safety and use of various cannabinoids on various conditions. So how do we look at that data and really relay that into what we're trying to do here in the US, where our clinical data programs are much more nascent and new? So those sorts of information and materials are really outlined in this subsection. It'll probably be important to really jumpstarting the cannabis industry in the US, especially as it comes to those facilities that are prepared under GACP, under GMP, to start exporting cannabis elsewhere, to places that already use it as medicine, like Israel. Manufacturers would also need to follow this IND process for their cannabis-based marijuana products that are intended for those clinical trials, including submitting detailed research plans and safety data. So we're working with a client, for example, that does have access to approved medicines from an Israeli IP stance, and has the clinical data to sort of back that up. And those are the types of projects that I think are looking at this next level of compliance to really get through the IND program, to get approval from the FDA, and begin manufacturing and distributing those components, or those already made products. Under CFR Part 314, this part covers the new drug applications, so NDAs, not to be confused with a normal NDA, but for cannabis-based medicines to be prescribed, the manufacturers have to submit these new drug applications to the FDA for approval as well. And that will demonstrate the efficacy and safety of the products through those clinical trials. So these come in various components, from the manufacturing cultivation side, the investigation of new drug process, to the clinical data that supports that in order to finally get this approved as a medicine. Subparts A through I in this section cover the applications for new drugs. The applications include patent information, because drugs can be patented in certain formulae, abbreviated applications to the FDA's actions and process, as well as hearing procedures for new drugs, and the approval and efficacy process from that clinical data. So I know that's a lot to take in, and that's sort of just setting up what might be viable as cannabis medicine. Again, probably not in botanical form, but think derivatives, think isolates, and think in terms of what that formulation looks like, backed by clinical data, to real patients who are getting help from this medicine in order to be prescribed by doctors in states that don't have a medical marijuana program, or in general for people to take and buy and access anywhere they can in the US without having to be in their home state. From a cultivation and manufacturing standpoint, CFR 21 Part 11 deals with electronic records and signatures. I mentioned earlier QMS, or quality management system. This is really backtracking and really tracking the inputs to any sort of production process or production batch, and managing the qualities within that QMS system is really important. A lot of our overseas clients, people we work with that are in this world already with EU GMP and looking to import or export cannabis, have to have some level of verification to that. And always there's a component that includes this quality management system, or the proper record keeping for electronic tracking of the cultivation, manufacturing, and distribution of cannabis products. So I'm not sure that that's going to be metric, right? We're probably not going to be using our statewide seed to sale tracking systems. These are much more internally used quality management systems. Companies like Isolocity in the cannabis industry, which are foraying into this, have produced a quality management system tailored to the types of plants and products we produce in anticipation of these types of efforts. And of course, Canada has already been doing this for a long time with their large export business. So subparts A through C of that sort of part 11, we're going to cover those records, the signatures, the production data needed, and really components like a QMS are crucial for this. Then you have part 1306 of the regulations, probably the last one I looked up here. If you were to search these regulations, they come up. And you've got, under this section, really covering the prescription of controlled substances. So what does it look like for the manner and the persons entitled to fill prescriptions? We know most of the stuff because we get prescriptions as consumers, but there's certainly a back end in terms of the refilling of prescriptions, the requirements prescriptions have to have for cannabis. This is something we ran into when we were helping Louisiana early on, which is a very medically oriented, following more along the lines of the Board of Pharmacy's recommendations on issuing out prescriptions. And initially, even in their language, they said prescription until we realized that that was in conflict with federal government. And they had to change that back to a recommendation. But in Louisiana, they were asking for what exactly is a dose of marijuana? What exactly should a patient be taking morning, noon, and at night? What conditions is it serving, and how do you gather the efficacy data off of those conditions and give them a consultation? So we were teaching people in traditional pharmacy how to really convert that process to what we knew in medical marijuana. And that did come down with recommendation forms to educate doctors and to teach them how to recommend a prescription, or in this case, a recommendation, but it was very much like a prescription for cannabis administration. And so these are all things that have to be sort of figured out, right, reported on, and be able to educate doctors given that clinical data for these various prescription types. The prescription drug industry spends a lot of money doing this. They send people out to talk to doctors and to get them to recommend their drugs for particular conditions. And there's, of course, a whole world around that. That's why it takes millions of dollars sometimes to create a pharmaceutical product in the first place, and then the patents on that and those returns on that investment that really come over a longer period of time. Cannabis is a little bit different boat. We already have this medicine out there. We know the efficacy, we know the safety, and we're really sort of filling in the back gap pieces to be able to get this out there at a level that is acceptable to the FDA under Schedule 3. So there's different controls on Schedule 3 versus Schedule 2 versus Schedule 4, and that's what's sort of described in this 1306 section, and the various provisions regarding retail pharmacies and the ability for doctors to write prescriptions and to get those prescriptions filled, as well as the moving of those products and the labeling, etc. So speaking of labeling as well, we've got a number of different labeling sections in the rules. Specifically, CFR 21 Part 201 and 202 covers labeling requirements for drugs in general. We have a myriad patchwork currently of different labeling and packaging laws in California versus Colorado versus Nevada versus the East Coast and various states. And a lot of those things may be the same, but I know the FDA just spent around $1.9 million just to study the warning label that should be on cannabis medicines, just for the study portion of this. So we could see different recommendations at a federal level if people start moving into the Schedule 3 arena that is sort of opening up here. And with those labelings, you have to have the indications, the usage instructions, warning labels, as well as any adverse event labels that have to be part of those little inserts that come with every medicine that'll also be included with cannabis. And CFR 202 deals with the prescription drug advertising and promotions regulations. So we have advertising and promotion regs that also vary between different states, but certainly we don't see a lot of commercials on TV for cannabis like we do for prescription drugs. So what does it look like for manufacturers to adhere to specific guidelines when advertising cannabis medicines with regard to compliance and accuracy to the FDA regulations? A lot of that is explained in CFR 202. So you can kind of see where the parallels are here, right? Every state's got an advertising section. Every state's got a labeling section, a packaging section, or production, batch tracking, electronic records. A lot of that stuff is out there. We've modeled this already on sort of what's in CFR 21 when we created the rules and regulations in the first place. But I think you're going to see a lot of changes to what really hasn't changed a whole lot when it comes to the DOJ, when it comes to the FDA, and the CFR 21 rules. The other link I wanted to share with you is, I think, a simplified version of what we've kind of been talking about. And this is the FDA's guidance on botanical medicines. And what they really delve into here is a little bit more of a narrative on what the steps would be. And this was made in 2016. I apologize if I said 2014, but 2016. And essentially what they've done is sort of break out the general regulatory approaches to botanical medicines, which have been considered for a long time, but have not been approved yet by the FDA. And more importantly, the components that a botanical medicine would provide. So things like the THC or the CBG or the CBN for further manufacturing purposes into drugs. And so you've got a lot of information in here that walks through sort of what the guidance would be for the industry on producing botanical drugs and what it looks like for those botanical drugs to be used in over-the-counter medicines, in Schedule 3 medicines, etc. So it talks a lot about the clinical phases and the trials that are sort of involved with that as well. And I think what's important to note is that a botanical drug product is really one that's containing plant-derived substances intended for the use in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of human disease. So cannabis would fall more than likely underneath this botanical drug definition. And it applies to any botanical medicine that would be used as a drug, including those that might be derived from cannabis if it becomes Schedule 3. And in this, it outlines a lot of those good agricultural practices. So just like we have good manufacturing practices, there are also recommendations on the cultivation side for growing, harvesting, collecting botanical materials to ensure quality and consistency. So a lot of people probably know, but the University of Mississippi was not meeting these standards for over 30, 40 years of cultivating the federal marijuana that was sent to federal patients for a long time. And surprisingly, in these recent DEA documents, they didn't mention once the federal program for investigational drugs with their patients, of which I think there are still 4 of them that are very much alive and still getting a can of 300 joints, people like L.V. Muska and Irvin Rosenfeld, who are federal patients since the 70s, 80s, 90s, who have been using federal marijuana that really is now trying to catch up to their own standards for a long time. But this means choosing the appropriate locations for cultivation, guidelines on soil quality, water quality, and environmental conditions, and also having the proper techniques and timing for harvesting to preserve quality, ensure the right dry and cure, ensure the consistency of that product as much as possible. I know in Colorado, this has become a big precedent for the way that we define our regulatory testing. And we have what's called reduced testing allowance, which means you can test less often if you can prove that your process is consistent in the contaminant-free portion of it and the potency that is derived from the cannabis every time you grow it. So the more adherence we have to our standard operating procedures, our quality controls, and in fact, in that RTA, you're now required to put together a HACCP plan or Hazard Access Critical Control Point plan that outlines sort of the process flow map of how you're growing your products and where your critical control points are in those processes. Each of those critical control points also has critical limits indicating what's a major, minor, or critical failure to those control points. And that has to be analyzed along with record keeping that's reviewed at least once a week on cleaning and at least once a month on maintenance of equipment that should all be involved in an SOP development. And so really getting that down and further expanding on how we're writing our SOPs, how we're adhering to them, and who's in charge of what and where the buck stops is advancing slowly in places like Colorado. But I think for the rest of the industry is a major gap and hurdle that has to be overcome, especially if you're going to get into good agricultural practices and cultivating a standard that's going to meet the FDA and their approval. Furthermore, it goes over the GMP stuff we talked about, processing botanical materials to ensure purity and consistency, other requirements for storing botanical ingredients to make sure there's no degradation or contamination. The other thing it'll talk about is stability studies and looking at how long does it take for a particular product that's been manufactured or a particular cannabis flower to degrade over time. Again, that's sort of arbitrarily set in Colorado at 9 months, but without a stability study under various conditions to really test that, you're not going to be able to get through the FDA's licensing guidelines without that stability testing. And that may be something you can start sooner than later, knowing it takes a amount of time to get there. So I think it's important to kind of note that. The other thing you'll have to do in these applications is identify and characterize your botanical drug product, which means the source of the product, including its taxonomy information and chemical profile. The standardization of how do you standardize that botanical product to ensure consistency of the active ingredients and the potency, as well as the quality control and frequent testing for purity, potency, and contamination, including microbials, as well as pesticides, heavy metals, or other contaminants like we currently do in many of our states, but not all of them. Then you're going to have to look at sort of what the clinical development looks like on preclinical studies, which may already be out there in abundance, and the clinical trials for specific conditions. What does the trial design look like? What is the trial going to, and how does it evaluate the efficacy and safety of the botanical drug? And what are those clinical endpoints to measuring the effectiveness of that product for any specific condition? So all of that sort of has to be applied with for these INDs and for the eventual approval of a product as it comes through this process. Then you have other regulatory considerations like that new drug application or NDA. What's the process for submitting an NDA for botanical drugs, including requirements for clinical and manufacturing data? Labeling as well, like we mentioned, for botanical drugs, including ingredients, dosage, and use. And then you've got a lot of record keeping from the cultivation practices, including the plant health, harvesting message, on-site conditions, as well as the manufacturing process for processing steps, quality control, and storage. So I think it's just important to kind of note that there are some guidelines out there. We talk about Schedule 3 as if it's a nice political step forward. And I think more of the comments submitted to the DEA were really asking for a descheduling because a lot of this doesn't quite fit exactly how we do the cannabis industry to how the FDA would want the cannabis industry done. I think it's important to note that because if we are going to move in that direction, catch up with the rest of the world and start producing real cannabis medicine with real efficacy, safety, and clinical data and trials around it, then we really have a big step up in our compliance that we have to take as an industry. Versus say descheduling where we can leave this more almost like alcohol or tobacco, where the industry itself is regulated and maybe the TTB or the Tax and Trade Bureau of the federal government oversees the movement of that product and taxation between state lines because it's not a Schedule 3 substance. And these are really important considerations, I think, for our policymakers and for our industry advocacy groups as we move forward to a future where cannabis is no longer Schedule 1. So one way or the other, especially if Harris is elected this November, that's the big signal point the DA just came out with, is that they'll be dealing with this in the new year, and that presidency certainly matters. but so does which direction our industry ends up taking. So I wanted to just kind of outline what those practices look like, what the Code of Federal Regulations is, what the FDA's guidance sort of states, so that you have a better understanding of what it'll take for your marijuana business to really meet those standards and to start the process sooner than later if you're hoping to move into Schedule 3. So I thank you for joining us today in our last of our series. I'll go ahead and open things up in the chat. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them here at the end.